Trump has just taken the action that puts Cuba on the brink of collapse. This Tuesday, May 19, 2026, Havana is now in the global spotlight, receiving humanitarian aid from Mexico and Uruguay. While Washington tightens the siege against authorities, supply networks, and allies who are still trying to keep the dictatorship alive. Cuba is receiving grains, powdered milk, and hygiene items because the regime can no longer provide the basics for its own population. And that's where Trump's siege gets even tougher. Trump's move is brutally simple. Before firing a shot, he makes Cuba lose energy, lose momentum, lose protection, and lose control over its own population. And when an island governed by communists needs a foreign ship to secure basic goods, while the United States targets its military and political elite, the message becomes clear to Diaz-Canel and to the old names of Castroism. Either Havana surrenders now, or each new blackout could become the final push needed for a much heavier American action. I'll tell you all about it in a moment, but right now you'll want to be subscribed to the channel to stay well-informed, real-time information, with the best journalistic quality you've ever seen, with the standard of credibility Milson Alves. The ship Asian Catra arrived at Havana Bay carrying about 1,000 to 1,700 tons of supplies sent by Mexico and Uruguay. Officially, it's humanitarian aid. Politically, it's a sign of collapse. A dictatorship that for decades sold the image of resistance now depends on external shipments to try to ease the shortage of essential goods. The arrival of this aid happened at the same time that tensions with the United States rose, and that detail changes everything. Havana is trying to show that it still has friends, but the image that reaches the world is of a cornered island with blackouts, fuel shortages, and an economy on life support. Trump's attitude, which accelerates this perception, was to use energy squeeze as a political weapon. After Maduro's fall in Venezuela, Washington began targeting the shipment of oil to Cuba, leaving the regime without the resource that supported part of the island's internal machinery. The Associated Press reported that the difficulties worsened after the interruption of the main shipments of Venezuelan oil and the American threats against anyone supplying Cuba. The result is direct. There's a lack of gasoline, a lack of energy, a lack of stability, and an abundance of fear within the regime. Cuba is not being treated as a nation in a common crisis. It is being treated as a hostile piece in the Caribbean, too close to the jungle. And it's too important to be ignored. Trump has already understood that he doesn't need to start with tanks in the streets to break the regime. He can cut off fuel, punish political operators, scare foreign companies, isolate the military, and pressure banks. And force Havana to spend its limited resources just trying to keep the lights on and food on the table. The new sanctions confirm this strategy. Washington targeted 11 Cuban officials, including figures connected to the political, military, police, intelligence, and communication sectors. This is not a symbolic sanction against decorative names, it's a direct attack on the apparatus that keeps the regime standing. The police control the streets. Intelligence monitors opponents. Communication controls the narrative. The military protects the leadership. When Trump targets these sectors at the same time, he's not just applying moral pressure, he's dismantling the internal defense structure of the dictatorship from within. The American government justified the offensive by saying that the communist elite prioritizes its own interests while the Cuban people pay the price. It also accused Havana of allowing foreign intelligence, military, and terrorist activities on the island. This is the part that weighs most heavily in the national security narrative. When Cuba becomes, in Washington's eyes, a base for United States adversaries in the Caribbean, the issue is no longer just about human rights, but becomes one of territorial defense. Havana felt the blow and responded with a threat. Miguel Diaz-Canel stated that any American military action would cause a bloodbath and bring consequences for regional peace. It shows desperation. A secure government doesn't need to turn every bit of pressure into a threat of war. The Cuban regime knows that the internal situation has gotten worse. It knows that the population is tired, and it knows that if Washington keeps tightening energy, finances, and logistics, revolutionary rhetoric doesn't pay the bills, doesn't turn on the fridge, and doesn't put food on the table. The arrival of humanitarian aid puts Cuba in a humiliating position. The regime tries to sell resistance, but receives emergency shipments to deal with shortages. It tries to talk about sovereignty, but depends on other governments to ease the crisis. It tries to accuse Trump of aggression, but can't hide that the island has lost the ability to sustain itself. The American pressure works precisely because it hits the dictatorship's weakest point, the gap between the official propaganda and the difficult life of the average Cuban. The movement also sends a message to other nations in the region. Whoever supplies Cuba, finances Cuba, or helps shield Cuba could become a target. Trump is turning the island into a test of loyalty in the Western Hemisphere. The question for neighboring governments has become simple. Will they help a besieged dictatorship, or will they avoid confrontation with Washington? This is how the White House reduces Havana's room to maneuver without having to announce a military operation on the first day. The most dangerous point for Cuba is that this pressure creates a path for escalation. First comes the financial blockade, then comes the energy squeeze, then come the sanctions against the military and intelligence, and then comes the national security justification. If Havana reacts with provocation, Trump gains the argument to raise the tone. If Havana stands still, the internal crisis keeps eating away at the island from within. The Cuban population is caught in the middle of this clash. The Associated Press showed residents reacting with hope to the arrival of aid, but also with frustration over previous delays. This reveals an uncomfortable reality for the regime. People don't live on slogans, they live on food, energy, medicine, transportation, and hygiene. The White House knows that a direct invasion would have political, military, and diplomatic costs, so Trump's approach seems colder. Suffocate first, weaken later, force the regime to make mistakes, and only then put tougher options on the table. This is the attitude that makes Cuba seem closer and closer to a major clash. It's not just explosive rhetoric. It's a practical sequence that cuts off fuel, isolates authorities, threatens suppliers, and exposes Havana as a vulnerable island. Now, what happens depends on how the regime reacts. If Diaz-Canel doubles down and tries to turn the internal crisis into mobilization against the United States, he could accelerate the scenario of confrontation. If he accepts setbacks, he opens a crisis within the communist elite itself. If he continues to depend on aid ships, it confirms to the world that Cuba has already lost the ability to retreat and to resist without help. Trump put Havana in this tight spot. Either the regime changes, or it sinks into isolation, or it gives the justification for a heavier American action. I'm Milson Alves, global internationalist, and my purpose is to keep you well informed with the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end check out the comments so you can be even more engaged with the Milson Alves community.